All right, we're
Okay.
recording.
Great. So we're going to start
I'm
by...
Kristen.
Great. I'm Tom.
I'm Brian.
I'm Alicia.
Abby.
Welcome.
And we're going to start by talking about the case studies. Right.
Sweet.
Case studies, yep. Freeman.
West or yep, chapter 1.
Right. So one of the students I had was, his name was Salvador. He's from a Mexican background. And the mother didn't know what to do with him. He was kind of a problem child, acted out a lot in school and also in the home. And the mother would just kind of give him whatever he wanted, didn't know how to deal with him. And the father wasn't in the picture that much. The father was working either other places in the U.S. or in Mexico. And occasionally the father would come back home, but when the father came back home, then it seemed like the child's behavior got worse.
Mm-hmm.
And they suspected that there was some child abuse, but there wasn't any evidence that they could point to. And there was one teacher who kind of started to make a connection with him. One thing I found in reading all these things was the most important thing was for somebody in the school to be able to reach the kid and make a connection. And this one teacher, he got placed in her class after he'd been in somebody else's class and hadn't done well. And he did okay, but then the next year he got placed into a classroom with a male teacher who was Hispanic or Latino, and that guy seemed to be able to forge a connection with him, and he started doing better.
Well, I'll share one of mine.
Okay.
One of the case studies. A girl named Moni, M-O-N-Y. She was from a refugee. She's from a refugee camp in Thailand, and she arrived in the U.S. Pre-kindergarten. And she speaks. It's Khmer. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Khmer, is it?
Is she from Cambodia?
Yeah. And she's in a community, very diverse community, but not many other Cambodian students, so that made it difficult for her. But she arrived, obviously being a refugee, which comes with it, it's many factors. But she was very quiet, which is kind of tricky too. At that age, you're learning a language, let alone
Right.
A new language.
Right.
But she was passed on from a kindergarten teacher to a first grade teacher, and her first grade teacher, similarly as in Salvador's case, her teacher took an interest in her and realized that she was quiet, didn't quite get along with other students except for the one or two other Cambodian students in the class. She was apparently an exceptional artist even at that age. She was very in tune in the drawing and unfortunately in the just as this teacher who did the case study was really connecting with her, she was transferred to a different school because her parents moved, and which is common too, or a common obstacle in learning English and getting to know the school system and whatnot. Is a lot of these immigrants are on a very transient basis. But anyway, she followed her to the next. This teacher followed her to the next school to do this case study. She continued to struggle actually, and noticed that a lot of these teachers just didn't quite know how to connect with her.
Right.
But this teacher mentioned too, she had a class of 30 or so students, and she was able to connect with this student, this Moni student, but I mean, if you think about it, how much time that took just to connect with her. As a student, or as a teacher, I guess the questions I had was, how do you, 30 plus students, that could feel overwhelming. Not that, maybe they can connect with other teachers or counselors or whatnot, but that can feel like a daunting task, especially if you're not feeling like you're able to
Yeah, to give
dedicate that
extra
much
more
time
attention to one,
certain
it's like you
Right.
kind of have to ignore, not pay close
Mhm.
attention to another one and
Right.
Yeah, and I think
navigate.
that was the case study where they were saying like the majority of like the input that the teacher that puts on them, like they won't get to see the results really until like the
Yeah.
following year.
Yeah.
And so like, I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting, like knowing like just because you don't see an improvement now doesn't mean it's not gonna happen, it just might take more time.
I think that's one of the basic things about teaching, is that you don't really see a lot of, impact that you have.
The old cliche metaphor, planting a seed.
Yeah, there you go.
But that's why students like go and like visit back to
Yeah,
the teachers.
which is always so cool
That's kind
for
of
the
like,
teacher.
Yeah, that's kind of like a result
Yeah.
of like showing that you really did make an impact. They come visit you.
But
Yeah.
it was impressive that the teachers in the case study would follow the kid and talk to
Yeah.
the person who had them the next year. I
Mhm.
mean, that was
Like that does
that's what you
show
should do.
interest.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah, and again, though, you ideally should,
right.
but how do you,
Yeah.
for 30 students,
I
it's
know.
almost like you have to pick and choose, which is kind of a Sophie's Choice kind of deal here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's the reality of it.
Right.
And that can be very difficult to accept, because a lot of us go into teaching, wanting to affect every.
It's also too,
individual,
it's like
but we're human.
of the
Yeah.
few that do need help, and maybe the few that don't seem to need as much attention, they might be doing great academically, but they're withdrawn socially, or they have issues at home, and there's all these underlying factors that you're not seeing, and I don't feel that we're here just to help them succeed on tests to move on to the next grade. I mean, yeah, that's
Oh,
great,
yeah.
they're doing well academically, but there's all the other factors that have to take into consideration.
Like, yeah, and this quote in here says a teacher should put more effort into who they're teaching and not what they're teaching.
Yeah.
And that
And
kind
that
of
kind of looks.
I think that is so true. And that's, I mean, this whole stress on standardized testing now is really getting away from that.
Yeah, and then of course there's like the growing class sizes and everything. Like you said, like there's 30 something kids in the class. Like how do you connect with every single child? Like when you're just trying to also make sure that every single child passes the standardized testing so you can get that funding. It's like
Yeah, right.
it's
One thing I thought of when I was reading this stuff was that it's really important for there to be other adults in it. Like you're the teacher, but maybe the kid connects with the janitor, or there's a counselor, or something like that. That's really important.
yeah, like I've been doing the Compass to Campus
Yeah.
thing. And like I found that I have my students I really connect with that the teacher can't always get to, and like she has me like work special like one-on-one with some of the students. So like it's amazing just how much like volunteers and parent volunteers can make a difference in a classroom like that, especially when we don't have as much time to dedicate.
Especially volunteers or adults who are different, of different ethnicities too,
Yeah,
and
for
even
sure.
a different gender than the teacher. Just any way to connect to those students that may not
Variety of
connect with the one
opportunities.
teacher in there. Yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of guys in the class may not connect with their female teacher and vice versa.
Right.
And just that addition of someone else in there because there's a lot of guys aching for male figures in their class and vice versa.
Absolutely. Go ahead and share mine. I read about Eugenia. She's a 5-year-old, and attends a bilingual kindergarten. She was born in the U.S., but her parents were illegal, undocumented immigrants who later, after she was born, established residency. She had a teacher from Puerto Rico who was able to kind of connect with her.
Oh,
Her
right.
parents didn't have a whole lot of educational background, much less English skills. Is that still recording?
Shouldn't be, keep talking.
And so this Hispanic teacher that she had was really able to communicate, which was number one, with her parents, which helped her parents kind of feel able and confident to try to be involved as much as they can in their daughter's education, whether it be, regular teacher meetings, trying to volunteer in the classroom, all that stuff.
Mhm.
On the flip side, her parents are uneducated, their background, and they can't necessarily help her with the academic work. So even though they are very involved and willing to be a presence in her academic life, she doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of home support. In contrast, there was a 9-year-old named Farah from Iraq, I believe. And Iraq. And her parents were both highly educated. He had originally gotten a job as a translator when the war broke out, and ended up moving his family to the U.S. because after a while he was receiving threats, and it just became a hostile situation for him and his position and his family. And after coming to the U.S., they had to take kind of mediocre jobs. He had a meat packing plant, and her at some other
Yeah, right.
lower they were overqualified for the jobs that they had to take, and so they struggled to make these ends meet. And they can support her at home, but the parents are kind of more focused on getting themselves economically stable and all these different stresses about coming to a new country and navigating that they're not as available to help her at home. So even though that they have the background or the academic knowledge and could potentially support her, she kind of is a little bit alone in her academic endeavor, I suppose.
That was a common theme in a lot of those readings, that the parents were just struggling to keep their heads above water, and they
Yeah.
were just trying to survive, so they didn't have time at home to give a lot to their kids.
And it's interesting, though, to see these two stories and the different pros and cons that they come to. I mean, here's this one girl whose parents were undocumented immigrants and really uneducated, but they were very willing and wanting and making time to be involved.
Mhm.
And then you have this other background where they are highly educated and they have a higher economic standing, but there isn't that support, and it was an interesting kind of comparison to. You can't always assume that just because they come from another country and they seem to have
Right.
money that there's
Right.
necessarily that level of
Right, that's
support.
true. But at the same time, it talked in there about how there were some students who were illiterate in their native
Mhm.
language. They didn't have the background of reading and writing, even in their native language. So
Mhm.
the kids who do have that seem like have a leg up, at least
Absolutely.
reading and writing is part of their routine.
But I mean, you can have 5 legs up and
Yeah,
two legs
that's
down.
right,
And,
that's
I-
right,
yeah.
that's right.
It just depends how the factors interact, and that both these girls could be equally disadvantaged, even though they're so
Sure.
Yeah, it's like
all
finding
over
that
the
balance,
board
you know,
spectrum,
like.
spectrum.
Each student has a unique situation.
Like, I think one thing I was talking about in one of the articles was like about how important it is for the teacher to become aware of the students' backgrounds and like find out about like Farah's family and what they like have had to deal with, and like why they may not give as much support or may not be able to provide as much for her. So I think that's just like an important point that's kind of brought up. It's like not all teachers can go and do a case study and find out everything about their students, but they can. I think it was saying like they can interview their students just a little bit, just have like little one-on-ones kind of thing. Just thought that was an important point that the articles brought up.
Yeah.
I guess I'll talk about my little friend here, Sharma, and she's a 5th grader who moved into a school in a farming community. And she was born in California, but she and her family had moved multiple times between California and India. She was Punjabi and she
right.
spoke that. Yeah, I thought that was fascinating. You don't really hear much about that culture coming over and what like their struggles are.
Much more in Canada, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Right across the border, I think there's a large population.
Yeah. But her parents brought her back to America to get a better education than she would in the schools in India. And she had attended like kindergarten, I think, in America, and then she was coming in for 5th grade. And they did have a bilingual education system established at that school, but something I thought was interesting that it said was that it was mainly providing for Spanish speakers, not Punjabi. And I just thought that was an interesting point that, like, there may be a lack of language, like, we already have this lack of bilingual language assistance for Spanish speakers, but then there's all these other languages that need to be provided for as well. So I thought this part of the article really brought in another perspective that we probably don't get to think about as much, because Spanish is such a very prominent language in America that we hear about a lot, but there's other ones. Anyway, back to Sharma. She was very well spoken with her friends, though, and she and her sister were very acclimatized and learning about Western culture. That they dressed that way, but then on the weekends they would go to their temples and learn more about their language and everything. So, sorry, my computer went on fritz. And at her school, she was categorized as being proficient in English, but she still had some struggles, even though like the school said she was proficient, but she wasn't completely proficient in as far as academics go, though she was very social with her friends and spoke very well with them. And
There
interesting.
really is a difference between social English and academic
There
English.
totally is.
Oh, there's so much. Yeah.
You can talk to a kid and he might be able to carry a full-on conversation with you. What's your favorite color? What do you like to do, for relaxation?
Right.
And you seem really fluent. But when you get into texts, they're lost until they kind of can learn these academic words and forms and ways of expressing.
That's
Not just
Yeah.
for English language learners either.
Oh, yeah,
for
absolutely.
so many
Yeah.
kids, ask them to write about their favorite color and got stuck. But yeah, that was definitely the case in Sharma's case there. So also a lot about what this part of the article was talking about was Sharma's struggle to balance between her native culture of the Punjabi culture and speaking that language versus acclimatizing to her new Western culture, because her parents, since they brought her over for this education, they put a lot of emphasis and they're pretty demanding about her education here, and they really wanted her and her sister to learn to be part of the Western culture, but then there's also that wanting her to embrace her native culture. So I think a lot of students, a lot of ELL students are having this struggle of balancing, even just in their language, speaking their language versus English, or you get my
That's
idea?
great that you brought that up, because some of the other readings that we had to do were addressing that issue of how
Exactly.
people from minority students are struggling with that to maintain their own culture, and that the articles that we read in there talked about how traditionally, the European-based culture sort of they presented as the best or something, and they were trying to get us to present information in the school in a way that didn't privilege one culture over another.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I think it's going to be something we're going to be watching in one of the videos, the Precious Knowledge video, coming up in upcoming weeks, but how there's some states that have an English-only law in their schools.
California and Arizona.
Yeah, that's the ones they're talking about. I just, I kind of did a little double take, and I was like, wait, what? They're, and these are, in the South where there's probably a lot more Spanish speakers. I'm like, wait a
Well,
minute.
That's probably why those
Why we're
mandates
learning.
are there. It's just for that reason.
Yeah.
It's,
Um,
but Tabby, you want to tell us
Yeah.
about one of your?
My case study. So mine were on 3 siblings: Jose, Guillermo, and Patricia. Patricia was 13 when she moved here. Guillermo was 16, and Jose 17. And their father was they're from El Salvador, and they were in a private school in El Salvador, and so they had started studying English, but they hadn't completely gotten it down yet. And they actually had to end up moving to Tucson, Arizona, because their father was assassinated.
I know it's really dramatic
Yeah,
story.
like it was actually a pretty inspirational one. I really
Yeah.
liked this
Yeah.
one. Yeah, and like
Yeah.
Guillermo had like 2 bullet wounds in his leg when he like came here, so I was like,
Oh
well,
my.
it's really dangerous. And they didn't live with their aunt when they went to Arizona. They like she provided like her and her husband like provided an apartment and like
Right.
would support them financially as best she could, as
Yeah.
well as like their grandparents from El Salvador. I guess they would also like send them money.
They
But
were
like
living by themselves, basically.
yeah, exactly. And Jose was like he pretty much like one he like felt guilty for the fact that his father died and he like wasn't able to stop it. And then 2, like he was like pretty much the one who was like bringing up his like siblings and like he was gonna now have to be their father figure because like I mean they're still young, they still need someone to. And so like so for him specifically, he did actually really well in school. But he did a lot of studying, which I guess he was like they poked fun at in school. Like you just study all the time, like you're no fun. But like he really did care. He focused on like algebra, calculus, physics, because those weren't like linguistically like stressed. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So
right.
he could like it was easier for him to pick up. And so he graduated from high school with the Presidential Award, and I think he went off to. They actually all went to University of Arizona and graduated from there. And he majored in engineering. Got his master's in he got his master's in engineering, and he now works for the city of LA. Guillermo, he was more focused on like becoming like friends with people and being like more social in his classes, but like he was still able to like get like fair grades. Like he graduated with like a B-, and he went to University of Arizona, and then he majored in engineering and international economics, and then got his master's in architecture at the University of Southern California. And then Patricia, she got a degree in chemistry and now lives in San Francisco and works at a pharmaceutical firm.
Wow.
So yeah, they all
very successful.
Yeah, I know. And I was really glad to hear about that.
That's really
And they
cool.
now consider the U.S. home,
Yeah.
whereas before, like they had no intention, or like, and now they have no intentions of going back to, or like
Right.
moving back to El Salvador. Whereas like with most immigrant children, they like when they first move like to the U.S., they like want to move back immediately once they get the chance. But
I kind of don't blame them for not
Yeah.
wanting to go back.
Well,
It sounds so.
father got
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it seemed like one point that the authors made with that was that those kids had quite a bit of support, you know, like the people who wrote the textbook knew them and they had an aunt, and so they had, that seemed really, really important. You know?
Yeah, and I said that they were like even from like when they first moved, like they started becoming involved in their church, which
Right.
like was really helpful when they had this like hearing to see for like an asylum to see if like they like
Qualified.
if they qualified to like stay here, and they're like, oh well, you're not in danger, and then they're like, well, one of us came here with a bullet wound. I think
Yeah.
that's kind of like evidence there's something wrong here.
Yeah, right.
It's good.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, they got a lot of the community support.
What's the, should we move on to the next
Yeah, we
section?
should move-
We've
and I
got
was thinking,
Less
I
than
mean,
10 minutes for
yeah,
our 30-minute mark.
But maybe
30 minutes.
whatever topics we don't or aren't able to cover in half an hour, we could do some
Yeah, we can like
replying
edit
on the
videos.
Yeah.
discussion board, you know.
You can just kind of like give a little brief summary of what else we learned about.
Oh yeah, so there were like different theories. There was one article, and the part I was supposed to talk about was called the context interaction model, which was just basically talking about how, and it came up in those case studies
Wait,
a lot too.
that was yours? That was mine too.
Oh, really?
That, that like two had the same thing to look
Wait,
at.
this one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That was mine too.
Yeah, some of them I think were lines.
Oh.
So anyway, that model has to do with looking at the school, and then, but the kids aren't just in the school, they obviously have a life outside the school.
Mhm.
So, looking at the context surrounding the school, right, Tabby, which was the home and the community and the neighborhood they're living in.
Yeah, and then the next level is like national and state context and like how that can affect like immigrant children and whatnot.
I'm kind of like finding identity when they.
Yeah. Well, like for example, like with the 3 kids I had, they had to like have a hearing that like, and that was more of like the state context and
Oh, gotcha.
just like
The legalities of it and all
Yeah.
that.
And also,
legal mandates.
yeah, and like No Child Left Behind, you know, it's
Mhm.
passed by the federal government, but it impacts kids in Lucille Umberger Elementary or whatever. I don't know if that's the right name, but.
See Lumberger here.
Oh,
Tell
okay.
you.
That's really interesting to me, taking in that whole context and that focus on the community and how that affects students. 'Cause I lived in Detroit last year.
Oh, okay.
And,
Wow.
I was substitute teaching throughout Detroit, and
What were you doing Teach for America?
my girlfriend was.
Oh, okay.
My girlfriend, and still is. She teaches at a school off of 7 Mile
Wow.
over there. And so I was in I was in a teaching program over there that has since transferred over here. But it's very interesting to me because there's a lot of focus, racial focus over there, and the failing schools and African Americans and such. But I was in schools that were nearly 100% African American and were struggling schools, really poor schools. And I was in schools that were 100% African American and were better than 90% of the schools I've seen around here. And it always made me think of the influence of of a community and the community of a school too. And I think we've heard a little bit of it. You know, a community-wide school that focuses on academics and you almost get that sense or that pressure to succeed academically. And if you don't, then you're outcasted in a way. And it's flipped the complete opposite in a lot of these more poverty-stricken neighborhoods. So where, you know, like one of the kids in your case study, if you're studying or making an effort to succeed, you're immediately outcasted. And it's just a strange dynamic,
Right.
really strange dynamic.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I guess just that focus on communities.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Always
But
been interesting.
something sparked a memory in me because sometimes your peers don't help you, you know. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
like I used to teach Japanese kids a lot, and there was this dynamic where what you wanted them to do was to go out and talk with Americans, but sometimes it would happen that a student would go out and do that and then get ostracized by the other Japanese students because they were not, you know, with the crowd, you know.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot of interesting factors.
But so you're saying that like the difference you saw between the schools that were really good and the schools that were not so good, a lot of it had to do with the community, with the schools and the.
But yeah, some of those communities like off of 7, 8 Mile, which are historically very rough communities in Detroit, struggle all across the board. I mean, talk about some of the most violent communities in the country and poverty-stricken, and then also too, you know, with ELLs, their parents are just struggling to survive. That takes first precedent, you know, on everything. And it's the same with these communities too. When you're out there just trying to put dinner on the table, it's hard to focus on calculus.
Right.
You know?
Sure.
And so yeah, I don't know. It's really fascinating to me. And I wish I could do a community assets map on you know, something like those communities.
Sure.
Because in hindsight, that would be
Yeah,
to
that'd
see
be fascinating.
what kind of assets that, you know, they do have and how you could
Right.
maybe
You could do a
start to flip
comparison.
something around there.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah.
So it's interesting that you're saying that like they had the same majority of an ethnicity and yet they're just so drastically different.
Something's different. Yeah.
So obviously it's not just the ethnicity that affects the school.
Yeah,
It's
it's
such a
exactly.
common misconception, you know, like that. Oh, like sorry for if this is weird to say, but like you know, like oh, an all-white schools can be better, you know. But
Well, yeah.
yeah, it's so
Well,
not
that's
true.
how some people think.
Yeah, sadly it is, you know. But it's like, that, yeah, I wish I could see a case study on that, you know,
Yeah.
or an assets map or
Yeah.
something.
what are those differences?
Exactly. Like, I think you're onto something about the community making such a huge difference.
Does everybody understand the difference between long-term and potential long-term English learners? I'm
Yeah.
I guess I'm not quite
I'm
sure.
mine was on potential long-term English learners, and it says that like they're usually K through first grade or K through fifth grade,
Mhm.
and they people who are they've lived most of their lives in the U.S. and they started school speaking a language other than English, and they need a great deal of support to achieve academically. They should be put in bilingual programs so they can build on their first language skills first, and then after they have a good grasp on that, learn English. And that it's like their chances for success always increases if they have like a well-educated and financially stable parents. That's always like a huge thing of it. I think Moni, the Cambodian girl, she was a good example for like the K through 1 study, and then or K through first grade, and then for like K through 5th grade, I think Salvador was a good example for that because he remains a potential long-term English learner because his home situation hasn't changed since
Right.
he started.
Yeah, that's the kid that I was talking about at the
Mhm.
beginning, yeah.
It says it's important for teachers to find out about the students' backgrounds, and it was saying how they're like, it was giving examples of like how teachers can do this. So like, one example to find out about their background is like just give out a questionnaire and find out how much do they know about reading and writing in English, and what their strengths and challenges are, or what they're worried about. Ask students to interview each other. That's another way you could do it, about their past schooling, and like have them report back to the teacher. Examine writing samples and then conference with students. More information teachers gather, the better they're able to help their students. I don't, who had just like long-term language learners, because that one's potential.
Yeah, I think I had like the long-term learners, but I feel like I kind of went over like all of those. Like there's the potential long-terms, there's the one's called the, I don't know if I'm saying this, like Fabian.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I
But,
found that like I feel like
those are the ones, the people who go back and forth over the border.
yeah, kind of like
They go and
Sharma.
come is the transition of big thing.
Right.
And like it was talking about the thing of fitting the students with interrupted formal education. I thought that was an interesting point. Definitely their education is interrupted, especially if they're going back and forth between countries that speak 2 different languages, you know, like that's probably kind of rough to have to speak one language and then suddenly go back to another and learn things in one language and then have to learn it in another. And that
Or
could
even
be
just going through a traumatic experience, like
Yeah.
the 3 siblings that watched their, dad get assassinated, even if they had stayed in their country and education in their own language, that would play a huge major factor in the whole next year or two as they process this and deal with it and return to school and have this hanging over their heads. Well, now they're in a whole new country.
And it'd be really
With that-
dangerous.
Yeah, with that same factor on top of trying to learn English, on top of not having a parent at home to do the shopping and cleaning and cooking and drive you here to that, they're on their own in this apartment and dealing with this grief.
yeah.
Not to mention having, I'm sure, emotional
Mhm.
PTSD kind of stuff.
Well, how could they not? Yeah.
Yeah, and then again, where do you factor that into your schedule?
Well, I'll feel.
Well, I mean, as far as
At 5 minutes,
4:30,
you feel
yeah.
sad.
as far as like getting therapy or
Yeah,
finding
yeah,
someone
counseling
to pay
and-
for counseling,
No, exactly.
find the time to get to
Right.
counseling. It's like
Resources.
that's almost like a white privilege in a way. Of,
Yeah,
of,
right,
Here, deal professionally with your grief rather
Mhm.
than good luck.
Yeah, it seems like they were just kind of thrust into this new environment, and then they had like,
Sink or swim.
yeah, like then they didn't have to like build the courts and everything.
Yeah,
they
they
had
had
to
to
build the
hear.
courts, and they had to deal with that while like adapting to a whole entire new environment, new family structure, and everything like
Yeah,
that. It's like,
apparently Patricia was the one who had the hardest time because, well, she was the youngest. She was 13, and she also was like pretty much the one who would like cook and clean for like her brothers, and then like
Right.
yeah, and so she, I kind of feel that for her, and like the loss of her father at a young age was like really like, because also where's the mother and
Yeah,
all this? They
that's what
never
I was
really brought
wondering.
that up, so that's like that poor girl.
Yeah, and
You know why she had to go look at the
where's the aunt too?
But apparently she became like the most like Americanized of all of them. Like she tried to like adjust to like American fads and whatnot. And so like she definitely put an effort to like
Yeah, she came in like so early on, like when she was the youngest, so she had the longest to kind of like, yeah, you know, be and acclimatize and everything.
it said it was the easiest. Like it was easiest for her to learn English than it was her brothers, just because she was younger, so it's easier to learn when you're younger.
I was kind of wondering about that same kind of adjusting with the potential long-term English language learners who like come in a lot earlier, and then they also have like the risk of being the subtractive English language learners who have that risk of losing their native tongue too. So I feel like a lot of these topics for long-term, they could be intertwined. You know, you can be
Overlap.
multiple ones.
Sure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, the one I read about was the newly arrived with limited schooling. So there was one kid who was from Somalia and had lived in like a refugee camp in Kenya for, I don't know, like 5 years, long time, and now was in Minneapolis, totally different environment, and hadn't had very much schooling at all. So was trying to figure out school culture, which is a big thing in and of itself, along with learning English. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one of the case studies I did on that kid. It was amazing just the difficulty that he had and his family had adapting to the cold.
Yeah, that just was a huge thing.
Just that in and of itself was like to come from Middle East and then all of a sudden you're in Minneapolis where it's
Freezing.
cold as hell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's landlocked states.
How are we doing for time?
Well, I think we're
5:11 right now.
coming up to 40 minutes.
We can
So, I mean, we didn't cover absolutely everything, but we did cover a lot. And
Yeah.
I think we got the spirit of
Yeah.
replying to
I
questions.
I think meeting face to face is important.
I think so too. Yeah.
Makes the class a little more
Real.
tangible.
Interactive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, look, we actually are in the class.
Yeah.
Should we just discuss the article real quick then? The one that, like, the one about, like, human rights?
Mhm. Do you want to do a quick run through
Let's just do a quick discussion instead of everybody saying, I was
initial
right, here's
factors.
what,
Yeah, okay.
Which I thought was pretty interesting. Maybe we can do that.
Well, there was one question I had for it, because it was talking about how it's really, like, it's your human, like, for, like, teaching, quality of education should be learner-centered and relevant to learners, as well as respectful to human rights. One of the things they say, though, is that, like, privacy, like, that's, like, a human right. But then I was wondering, well, if you're, like, going to be an ELL teacher and you have to be respectful towards their privacy, but at the same time you're trying to get to know them on, like, a personal level,
Yeah, right.
like, where is the line between, like, how close you should get to them and, like, figure out about their family situation without, like, making them feel like you're imposing on their life? Like, what do you think, like,
It's
a
a
good...
great
So
question.
you've got to utilize every single resource at your finger, from their student file to their past teachers to anyone that you can talk to without being super obtrusive.
If you like spy, if
You can
do
ask
that,
me a few
like that.
questions, but you're not going to be like, how much money does your parents make?
Yeah.
Are you illegal,
It's
documented, resident, or are your parents illegals? I mean, there's certain questions that you don't want to ask. Yet
That are none of your business.
that are
Yeah.
that are none of your business.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there are ways to kind of get a general understanding.
Yeah, you
and
can kind of
general
assume,
background.
Yeah.
make guesses.
And I've found in most cases too, in a lot of cases, not all obviously, but you ask something and you're gonna hear much more than you ever
Oh yeah,
Kids are so
kids
honest.
love
Yeah,
to share.
Like,
and,
no
well, yeah,
filter.
especially if there are struggles.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll want to be the first. And again, not always, but
Right.
a lot of times they'll want to let you know, like, this is how much I'm
Well,
struggling.
think
Thanks
about
for
it.
asking.
I think about a 7 or 8 year old that's from the U.S., grew up here, speaks English fine,
Yeah.
mainstream school, no problem. tell me, what does your mom and dad do for a living? Or ask them a general question. They will prattle on about
Yeah.
this, that, and the other thing. And usually their responses don't shock us because, yeah, you're a normal kid and a normal family and your parents do normal things.
Right.
So you get this new kid who doesn't really speak a whole lot of English and prattles on about what his experience in life was and what his family does. And you go, excuse me? You know, it's like, I never expected that response, but it's,
Yeah, like with
it's
the siblings, you know.
not normal to them, but that's part of their life, and that's part of what they're going to prattle on about when you ask them these probing general questions, just like any other English-speaking mainstream culture childhood.
Yeah, I think it also like makes such a big difference that hey, someone actually wants to listen to me.
Mm-hmm.
Like just being like allowed to share that when like it could be something that's really troubling to them, and just I think they can really appreciate having someone to share their experiences and just kind of maybe even just vent to, you know, just
Yeah.
having someone there for them.
But you also want to be tactful about
Of course, yeah.
the wording of your question, what you ask. You're being too direct, and like you said, you don't want to ask, "Are your parents legal residents?"
Well, yeah.
Because it's so very
Something you
touchy
probably
and
don't
hush-hush,
wanna know.
and they're terrified about the
Right.
was it ICE or whatever it's called, the people that come in and do like clean sweeps of factories
Oh,
and
gosh.
ask everybody and deport
Right.
them. I mean, they're terrified, so they're
Right.
very quiet to themselves and secretive, and there's ways to kind of pull information out of them without, in a safe way, without making them feel
Well,
defensive, like they have to put up these barriers.
and that's what was just appalling about what was going on in Alabama. And to be honest, I couldn't tell you the most recent of what's happening there, but they were accessing records of their students to get to illegal immigrants. And they were deporting these
Oh
the
my
parents.
gosh.
Yeah.
That's
And so
terrible.
obviously, and so a lot of these families were pulling students out of school, and it's like, yeah, talk about a fear, instilling fear in these students.
Yeah.
You think they'd want to tell you,
Yeah,
know,
it
about
just
their
seems so-
family? And it's just, yeah, it's not,
It seems
it's
so underhanded, you know? It's
Yeah,
like
I know.
not
That's like-
not to dig on the Sweet Home
Oh
Alabama.
no, it's
That's like
cool. I'm from
information that they
Washington.
have.
I just
Like-
live there.
information they have to have on the student, and then they're just like exploiting it and using it. I'm sorry, I have an issue with that.
Oh, a lot of people do.
But
yeah, I would.
well, I read that like for like ELL students, like a lot of times they go through a silent period where they're like really
Mhm.
quiet.
Absolutely.
So like they're quiet, where you should allow them their privacy without being too pushy. So like, what do you do if like a student just doesn't want to like open up to you or like give you the chance to like put forth effort into?
Well, there was one of the case studies was about a little girl, I think, like that. But I think, you know, you kind of have to let people be who they are. I mean, you know, I would guess I would lean toward, you know, not prying too much if she feels like she needs to be quiet. I mean, if it went on for the whole year and she never said anything, that'd be kind of extreme. But I don't think everybody has to be really talkative.
And that brings up a good point too, because the cultural differences, you know,
Right.
like I said earlier, a lot of kids will divulge more than you ever thought they would, but that's also a comfort cultural thing where, you know, they know me as a white male speaking to, you know, a 13-year-old white student maybe, there's already like this connection, maybe just the way that we appear or have grown up, you know, the culture we've grown up in. But if someone from a different culture, they could feel intimidated by me, for example. They could feel, you know, scared or unsure, or can I trust you, or what exactly is our relationship? There's so many barriers in the way there that could make it complicated. And I think one solution to that question would be coordinating with the school, with your co-teachers and counselors, and basically just to get a feel of how's a student in your class, what do they respond to positively, what do they respond to negatively, you know, and then you can kind of work to adapt that in your own classroom, any way to kind of get an edge in there. You know, and if it's bringing up an interest, maybe they hate English, which is my subject,
It's
and they like,
really
you know, and meanwhile they're talkative and outgoing in math, which would kind of talk about breaking stereotypes. But and that was one of my questions too. What about, when you're trying to represent multiculturalism in your class, what if a student doesn't want to be represented? Or they're for some reason ashamed or embarrassed,
Or they're
which
more
is
comfortable
sad,
sitting
but
in the
yeah, they don't want to bring up their differences, which I think is very, very common and kind of a sad result of the way our schools are and culture is set up. But you don't want to give them even more anxiety or angst. So yeah, how do you balance that too? And
I think a lot of it, these topics do come down to like safety in the classroom, feeling safe, feeling more. If you really don't want, the child obviously does not want this social recognition or public recognition to be called on. There are other ways to adjust things, or maybe during a general study time, to, maybe come down one-on-one and talk quietly with them or whatever. But it really is just recognizing that yes, you want as much information as you can, but you do have to respect if their parents are not willing to be forthcoming with it.
And it seems like you have to think about what information do you need. What kinds of questions are appropriate for you as a teacher to ask.
And I think I could go back to focusing on who you're teaching rather than what you're teaching. Because if what you're teaching isn't benefiting who you're teaching, then why are you teaching it?
Well, because the curriculum says you have to teach it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it doesn't always dictate how you teach it,
It's true. Very true.
which is where we come into play.
Well,
There's room for the human being in the classroom still.
yeah, there are humans yet. No.
But go ahead, Brian. You're going to say.
Well, I was going to say, should we
Wrap it up.
Yeah,
wrap it up?
I think so.
Call it a discussion?
Good job, team.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting.
I think now that we've initially kind of gotten together and worked out some technology
Yeah, right.
things,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and the next session will probably go a little bit smoother.
Yeah.
And I apologize.